Without further ado, I was thrilled when I wrote Vic, if he doesn't mind if I'll call him Vic. When I wrote Vic an email this spring asking if he would actually give our first lecture of the year. And I was thrilled for a host of reasons. One is that most probably close to 10 years ago, I had the pleasure of hearing Vic give a lecture at the center. And for those of you who know me, you know that I pretty much attend like every single lecture that is ever at the center. And I have to say, 10 years later, it is one of the more memorable, if not the most memorable, lectures because I learned so much. That one was on corporate governance and the need for new kinds of regulation in, is that right, Vic?
That's
yeah,
right.
corporate regulation and the law around that in India. And I learned an immense amount that not only has stayed with me, but whenever I meet people who are in business, I actually get to tout that out as though I actually know, something about it. But of course I do, because I was at that lecture. So I was thrilled because Vic's work I find amazingly engaging, but also because Vic's work has this immense range, and I feel like he's one of our scholars here who does work that offers something to so many of us, and therefore it makes him such an ideal person to get us going on our kind of intellectual work of the year. So for those of you who are not familiar with Vikramaditya Khanna, I just want to tell you a little bit about him. He has been at the University of Michigan School of Law since 2004 as professor of law. And before coming here, he taught at the Boston University School of Law for some years. And he's taught actually at very many places and been either affiliated with or taught at or been a researcher at a pretty impressive list at Harvard Law School, at Columbia University School of Law, at Stanford, at Yale. And so Vic is somebody undoubtedly in high demand. His own degree, his J.D., comes from Harvard. As I say, Vic is one of those scholars who seems to just have this amazing, capacious kind of knowledge. His areas of interest and research interests range from corporations, both in the US, I believe, and in India, to law, legal issues and economic development in India, to anti-corruption law and practice, to issues around globalization and the law. And then they veer towards things that perhaps are maybe a bit more unexpected in that list. Hollywood, Bollywood, and the law. So I'm always struck when I learn, the more I learn about Vic's work, how it really runs the gamut. And one sees the same thing in the areas of his current research interests. So before handing the podium over, I would just say that one of the things that really struck me is that Vic is not only working on very, very contemporary issues in the law. So among his current projects involve work on the home mortgage market in India, which we all know is a rather contemporary phenomenon, or judicial reform in India. He's working on a work to present policy recommendations. But he's also working on the history of kind of business organizations and economic growth, drawing insights from ancient India. And so I think it's a treat for us to have him as a colleague. It's a treat that he's willing to share his work. And so without further ado, thank you, Vic, for speaking at the center.
Thank you, Farina, for that much too generous introduction. That was extremely kind. And thank you to the center for inviting me to give this talk. When Farina told me that I'd be giving a talk here, she said, you're going to be the first speaker for a very active semester, so we want you to give an uplifting and exciting talk. And somehow in my mind that translated to a talk on dowry. So you'll have to bear with me as I try to make this not as depressing as it might otherwise be, hopefully. I'm very much looking forward to your thoughts and suggestions on this. This is actually a compilation of a couple of different works in progress that I have going on. Before I start, I do want to do a little bit of a plug for something, which is for those of you who are interested in law and legal issues in India, there's a new journal coming out called Indian Law Review that will have its first issue by the end of this month. Keep your eyes glued to the screen. I'll try to put up its link a little later. Anyway, so in terms of dowry, well, as we all know, dowry generates a tremendous amount of discussion, and actually there's quite a lot of regulation that relates to it. In spite of that, all the evidence we have seems to suggest that it's been rising, and indeed rising more quickly almost every year. What I'm hoping to do in this series of works in progress is to explore some of the changes in dowry practices to get a better sense as to what impacts dowry, in the hopes of being able to actually maybe begin to address it. The research that these series of works in progress relate to depend both on data work, archival work, and on interviews. So this has been something I've been sort of toiling away with for a few years. All right, well, so the basic structure of the talk is I'll provide an introduction to dowry, a little bit of background, as well as what kind of regulation applies to it in India. Those are not typos. Those laws are from 1860 and 1872. In India, we apparently like to have a lot of really old laws that apply. I can talk about how and why that gets there in a little bit. In terms of changes in dowry practices, I'm going to look at both increases and some decreases. Not every single one, because India is a very big country, so I can't cover everything. But in terms of increases in dowry, it's pretty clear that the largest increases have occurred from 1930s onwards, and particularly for government officers, by which I mean when the male is a government officer, which seems like a peculiar kind of area to see a rise in dowry demands, and we'll talk about why that is. And hopefully in the process I'll be able to tease out a new contributing explanation, for the increase in dowries. Also, another weird thing we notice with increases in dowry, they seem to get even higher after criminal penalties have increased, which seems to be the exact opposite of what you would expect. Normally you'd think things would decrease, and we'll talk about why that might be. We'll also talk about some places in India where there have been decreases, incredibly in Bihar and in Gujarat and a few other places. And what I hope to elicit through those discussions is that actually social norms are really important in regulating dowry practices and maybe thinking about how we can trigger them in some ways. Well, what insights, what do we get by studying changes in dowry practices? One of the first things we're going to discover is that actually the practice of dowry is uniform in the sense that you see it in a lot of places in India, but that's about the only sense in which it's uniform. The size, the level, the content, everything seems to vary tremendously by region, whether you're in an urban area or a rural area. And I'm going to suggest to you that those differences, because you see them over the years, might be relevant in how you think about policy in this area. I'm also going to suggest that we might want to think about unconventional supplementary tactics. Now, I want to use the word supplement because I don't think it's ideal to decriminalize anything here. I think we need to add on in interesting ways to try to utilize what's there. So some of the supplementary tactics I'm going to talk about is incentivizing third parties to provide aid in the regulation of dowry, including places like hotels. You might wonder why hotels. I'll talk about that when I get there. Maybe encouraging the state to make payments for certain kinds of activities, including enhancing women's employment prospects. I'm using terms very particularly here, largely because I'm a lawyer, but also because it turns out that increasing women's educational opportunities has very strange effects on dowry, but increasing their employment prospects seems to have a much more unidirectional effect on dowry. It turns out also when you look more closely at how changes occur in dowry practices, you begin to realize that some things that people thought might actually reduce dowry are probably increasing it, like inheritance reforms. But those same reforms, although they may not benefit the reductions in dowry, they're useful for other reasons, which may be worth noting. And then I want to end with, of course, a call for more research, particularly better data. I'm a data guy. I love data. I love history. I love all these sorts of things. In this particular area, it's really useful because we have so much variation in practice. So understanding what's actually happening will be very useful in developing policy reform proposals or just in enhancing your understanding. I also would suggest that we might want to start looking at proxies for dowry. Why is that? People have a habit of not telling you the truth. Part of that is because, it's illegal, as we'll discover. In fact, it's a crime to demand or pay dowry. But perhaps more important than that, because dowry sends signals both about your worth and how important you think the potential match is, people have a habit of lying. So it's good to look for actual proxies, and it turns out that one of the best proxies is gold prices. Why is that? Because so much dowry is given in the form of gold. So you tend to see increases in dowry practices or changes in dowry practices driven in some respects by movements in gold prices. Okay, and then hopefully talking a little bit about how norms can be useful in supplementing dowry regulation. All right, so introduction. Now, I think most people have a rough sense as to what dowry really is, right? Which is basically items provided by the bride's family to the bride and the groom and his family around the wedding and after, it turns out, as a condition of marriage. Those last 4 words are the most important, as a condition of marriage. If you're giving something voluntarily, by which they mean it's not asked for or hinted at or whatever, that's not considered dowry. That's just a gift. But things that are a condition of the marriage or the condition of continuing the marriage are thought to be dowry. Okay, now this can include household items like typically the wedding bed, the bedroom armoire, things like that, furniture, jewelry, of course, clothing. It turns out that wedding trousseaux have become exceedingly expensive. I spend time in a lot of cities in India. I'm from Delhi originally. I love going there, but every time I go, I get sticker shock because I go to weddings and I ask them, so how much was that? Typically, I mean the outfit, not the wedding. And usually it's in some like 6 or 7 figure rupee amount, which is just staggering to me. I remember going to a wedding where this poor girl, she seemed fairly slight in build and everything, and her outfit was about 25 kilograms. That's really, really heavy. All right. Of course, there's also property that can be exchanged, cash, and other things. And we'll talk about those as we get there. It's typically thought to be more common amongst Hindus, which it is, but actually it's been increasing in other communities too, including Muslim communities, Christian communities, and Sikh communities. For example, most empirical studies of dowry practices suggest actually the quickest rise in dowries occurring among Sikh communities. Why would that be? They never really had a tradition of that to begin with, but there you are. Now, I should mention one thing as I go through the talk. I'll sometimes make broad general statements about dowry. That's not because I don't realize there's a lot of variation. There is. That's one of the key themes in this talk. But the reason I do that is if I went through every single variation, I'd never finish. So I'm going to go for expositional ease here. I'm happy to add more context in the Q&A. All right, so what purpose does dowry serve? There are tons of different purposes dowry might serve. I've put some of the sources I refer to here. I've omitted the years because if I did, I'd have 55 pages, so I don't want to do that. Typically, it's a mix of different purposes. It can be thought of as a pre-mortem bequest to the bride from her family, largely because in many contexts in India, a woman doesn't have the same inheritance rights until very recently as men do. In some places, it's a groom price to the groom and his family. In other places, it's gifts to bond families. In fact, you can actually find a lot of examples where both the girl's side is paying, I say girl's side because that's the common nomenclature in India, girl's side is paying money or giving money to the boy's side, and then the boy's side gives the equivalent of bride price to the girl's side. They're usually not equal, but it's interesting. In those contexts, it might be viewed as more of a gift. It's also sometimes thought of a method of providing assets and income to sustain the woman in a new household. And of course, increasingly, it's become a status signal. I used to tell this story when I teach a seminar in India that to get a sense of how important status signaling is in India, all you have to do is to go to Purani Delhi, Naya Bas, Gully number 9. If people are interested, I can tell you exactly where that is later. Why is that? There's a particular dessert that's offered there called Daulat Ki Chaat. For those of you who are familiar with what that means in Hindi, that literally means the taste of money. Right? Now, what could that possibly mean? What that is it's a dessert where people take milk and makhan, for those of you familiar with what that is, and whip it till it makes into a really big kind of frothy dish. They put it in a clay pot, top it with saffron, of course, and chopped up pistachios and sugar and other nice things, and they sell it to you for 500 rupees a kilo. Okay, now, actually, sorry, 500 rupees a pot because it has no weight. Kilo would be meaningless. That was back in 1985. I'm pretty sure it's about 5 times more than that by now. Who eats this? Well, the beauty is this. Typically, it's the dish that the richest person in that environment will buy. Why? The moment you open up the top, it starts evaporating. and you're supposed to eat it leisurely. That is literally burning money, right? Why does someone eat that? It's a status signal to show that I have enough money literally to eat, because that's what you're doing in that context. Okay, status signals do matter. All right, now it's interesting, the concerns with dowry are only partially related to the fact that someone is paying for the privilege of getting married, because what counts as payment in a lot of different societies might not be viewed as negatively. The problems are typically concerns affiliated with the payment. For example, dowry, death, and murder, harassment of the wife and her family to extract more money as dowry, female infanticide because some parents think that this is too expensive to keep having daughters, and then of course poor investment in human female capital. Now why is that? Because if you have a set amount of income or assets, you have to decide how to spend it. You could spend it on educating your daughter, or alternatively, you might save it to provide as a dowry to somebody. If you think your primary goal is to get your daughter married, it's not obvious how you divide that money, but it's pretty clear that something more than zero will go towards the dowry, which means you have perhaps less investment in female human capital. All right, so I thought I'd give you a little bit of history. So it's interesting, prior to the British coming to South Asia, most of the literature, and I was very surprised by this because I expected to actually find disagreement amongst historians, I found almost none, which was remarkable to me. Whether you're looking at Sanskritists, whether you're looking at people who study 17th century India or study 11th century India or 5th century India, they all tell you pretty much the same thing. Dowry was common but trivial. Now that's interesting. You cannot find, apparently, any instances of dowry death or things like that prior to somewhere in the late 1800s, even though dowry's been there since about the 3rd millennium BC. One of the reasons for that apparently is that the amount and the context of dowry was almost entirely determined by caste-based norms. And you have to remember, within the Indian context, virtually everybody married within caste. And typically the caste chieftains, or more importantly the subcaste chieftains, would not attend your wedding unless they had some indication that you had maintained the norms of whatever that wedding structure was, one of which was actually dowry. Now what's fascinating is not only do the Indian sources suggest that it was not that much, but outside sources suggest it, whether it's Islamic writers in the 11th century, the Greeks in the 3rd century BC, which is strange. They all came and said, isn't it fascinating, they have such opulent weddings here, but the dowry is trivial. And the reason they were so aware of that is because in their cultures, dowry was substantial. So dowry was actually endemic throughout the ancient world, whether you're looking at ancient Greece, ancient Rome, the medieval Europe, Mideast, Brazil. Brazil's not ancient, of course, but you get the idea. In fact, evidence suggests that both dowry and bride price were prevalent in India before the British. Now, what's intriguing, of course, about this is, given how common dowry is, the puzzle is why is it there still in South Asia, but pretty much nowhere else? Most scholars will tell you the reason for that is probably some mix of modernization where women enter the workforce more. And for whatever reason in India, although women are often highly educated, you don't see that level of female labor market penetration that you do in other countries. That might be one explanation. Of course, the trick with that is that doesn't explain why it disappeared in Rome and Greece, because I would hardly describe their tail ends as being examples of modernization. But also, it's puzzling at some level because when you look at practices in India, they seem to use modernization as an example to actually enhance the amount of dowry rather than reduce it. So it's puzzling on multiple fronts. I thought, of course, given that we've mentioned here that pre-British you don't see much significant amounts of dowry exchanging hands, it's worth noting, well, what happened during the British time that you see now an increase in dowry? So the British, of course, as many of you know, basically let religious laws as they perceived them and as they codified them govern personal attributes of people in India, by which they meant marital law, custody, maintenance, and, of course, inheritance. Indeed, the British themselves did not consider dowry a problem until sometime in the 1930s. That was the first time they legislated about it. They thought sati was a problem. There was a British ordinance in 1829, a full 100 years prior to any regulation on dowry. One of the interesting things about how the British did their codification of religious laws in the subcontinent was they basically asked the religious leaders of each group what your religious practices were. So they asked the Brahmins for the Hindus, what did you do? And amongst the Brahmins, dowry typically involved land transfers because Brahmins often had large amounts of land, often given by kings or and for other reasons. That was recognized by the British, and it was assumed to mean that dowry for everybody involved the grant of land. That had an important impact because it changed the structure of land ownership in large parts of India, where it went from being owned by like a joint family to being something that could be sort of parceled out by individuals in various ways, creating actually a land market. In that process, the British also strangely decided that women apparently wouldn't be granted the kind of property rights that historically apparently they had in the subcontinent. Part of the reason for that was the British's initial legislation in this area was in the 1850s, which was at a time when the British authorities in England didn't actually recognize women's rights to own property when they were married. So they would have, if they were going to actually recognize property rights for women in India or in the subcontinent, that would have actually been contrary to what they were doing back home, which of course would have raised some strange kind of response. It's worth noting that the term for most dowry items in India is stridhan. For those of you familiar with Hindi or Sanskrit, that means women's wealth or women's property. So they clearly had the ability to own it. All right, so we get dowry. Now, as we'll talk about how it escalated over time, I thought it would be useful to mention how it's actually regulated. After all, I'm a law professor. I generally don't like to talk about law that doesn't work because that makes me feel bad. But in this case, I think it's almost essential. All right, so this is actually a rough sample of the different laws that apply. There are some other laws, but they're pretty small. The key one is Section 3 of the Dowry Act of 1961. Yes, 1961. The giving and demanding of dowry has been criminally prohibited since then, and the burden of proof is actually on the husband to prove he and his family did not demand or receive dowry. How many convictions have been obtained under this standard? Very few, it turns out. We'll talk about why hopefully in a few minutes. Because there's a perception that the Dowry Act was not doing a lot of things, the Indian government started amending the Indian Penal Code, which dates from 1860. The amendments, of course, occurred in the 1980s, not 1860. So Section 304B of the Indian Penal Code says if a woman dies within 7 years of her marriage in suspicious circumstances, right, and there's some evidence of cruelty or dowry demands prior to that, then the law deems her husband guilty of the murder, carries a 7-year penalty, 7-year jail time. If you can show that before a woman's death there was cruelty or dowry, even if there weren't suspicious circumstances, right, then the law will deem her husband responsible for the death or suicide. In India, abetting suicide, that is aiding or encouraging someone to engage in suicide, is actually a crime. Okay. And then, of course, in the later part of the 1980s, early 1990s, you have the enactment of Section 498 capital A, which treats dowry demands as equivalent to harassment, which is a crime in India. The main thing of import from this is 498A allows the police to arrest a broad array of people for harassing a woman, including their in-laws and anybody else that can be sort of tangentially connected to that. You don't necessarily need a ton of evidence to do this, and that's been actually a point of tremendous debate and concern within India, apparently. There's also Section 406 of the Indian Penal Code, which is a criminal breach of trust. Typically, that means you're not returning a woman's dowry property that belongs to her. Okay. There are also various rules put forward in 1985 regarding you need to maintain lists of what you gave as dowry and the reason, or what you gave as gifts, because if you're going to claim that someone should return your dowry, you need to be able to prove what it is they should be returning. So lists are required. And there are, of course, non-criminal civil laws that protect women, for example, anti-domestic violence legislation and things like that. So after so many laws, you think, well, geez, and a lot of these actually do a lot of, from a legal perspective, amazing things. They reverse the burden of proof pretty much in every single case. That means the husband has to prove they're innocent. So you'd expect to see a lot of guilty convictions, and you frankly don't. Okay, why are they thought to be not successful? Well, one of the key reasons is what the definition of dowry is, right? A demand for gifts versus a voluntary giving of gifts. How do you tell the difference, right? Especially because you don't always have to ask for something. People can kind of get it. No one's entirely stupid. So if you sit there and you're having your premarital discussions and someone says, oh, well, would you like anything for us to give you? And you say, no, we don't need to give you anything. And then 2 minutes later you say, isn't that a nice Audi 8? I bet that would look wonderful in my driving lot, right? people kind of put 2 and 2 together. Right? They get it. And of course, that definition, though, leads to a lot of slippage. Perhaps most important is that enforcement is both corrupt and slipshod. How can you do both? Well, we manage. This cuts in both directions. Why? Sometimes the police don't take dowry claims seriously. Part of the reason for that is they often expect to get a bribe to do something. And if you don't have the resources to bribe them, they're not going to be inclined to push the case very hard. It goes way low on their list of priorities. On the other hand, sometimes the police will be inclined to actually pursue your dowry claim in order to extract money from the boy's side. That has been the typical complaint behind 498A, right? There's precious little data on any of this. The only data we have is that the conviction rate for 498A is somewhere between 5 to 15%. And people are like, wow, that seems so low, until you realize that the conviction rate in India generally is about 30%. So it's actually not as bad as it might look in that respect. Anyway, it's worth noting that the police here and lawyers are often thought to be complicit with various groups in allowing this practice to continue and get worse, largely because they take cuts in the action to do this. So for a 498 case, if you're extorting money from the boy's side, typically the idea is that the girl and the police share some of the money. Why can the police do this? Their arrest power is largely unconstrained in India. It's very easy for them to arrest people, keep you there for about 2 days before you get bail. And that matters because who knows what might happen in those 2 days? 2 days is a very long period of time. All kinds of accidents might occur in police custody. It's incredible how slippery apparently the floors are in the police stations in India. All right, one final point I should make about why the law is not thought to be successful is judicial delays in India, which most people are aware of, make conviction really unlikely, even if everyone else's incentives are bona fides. Why is that? Imagine the following fact pattern. Your proof that someone demanded dowry is that they observed, they witnessed someone saying, I want this item, or somehow indicating it, right? Your trial, because of judicial delays, will occur in about 9 years. So, 9 years later, people's memories tend to fade. I can't remember what I had for breakfast today, right? And that's true every day. That's not specific to just today because I was preparing for this. It's just, I don't think about it, right? 9 years later, am I going to remember whether someone deliberately asked for something? You might. But boy, a good lawyer will find ways to poke holes in that story. They'll ask you, what was the outfit the people were wearing? Well, outfit? I don't know. Well, if you don't know what they were wearing, how can you know what they said? All of a sudden, you have reasonable doubt. Voila, right? These delays, the enforcement problems with corruption and slipshod sort of police work, make it really, really hard to prosecute dowry cases, which means most of the time, to the extent there's a penalty imposed on the boy's side, it'll often be whatever payment they make as part of a 498 claim. Okay. Now, that's depressing. I should mention, though, that one of the things that complicates the way dowry works in India is that India does not have a uniform personal law. We've mentioned this before. You have different religious codes that apply to your personal matters. And the reason that's this going to be significant is because until 2005, women in India who were of the Hindu faith were not actually entitled to inherit anything from their parents' side. That changed in 2005. Now they have equal rights. It's pretty clear that the parents have decided to largely ignore that and either do inter vivos gift transfers or just convince them it's not worth fighting over, right? It's also worth noting that upon divorce in India, the division of assets is typically not based on notions of community property. People tend to keep whatever's in their name. And if you're often not working in the labor force, that means your assets are not a lot. This basically means that the woman's main chance for having access to assets is either going to come through inheritance at the time of dowry because she doesn't typically get inheritance later, or it'll be whatever are her assets that belong to her, stridhan, at the time of divorce, which are also typically given to her at the dowry time. The reason I mention this is this creates a very strong incentive for the parents of the girl to want to give dowry in a way that looks like stridhan, because that's her security in many ways. And this is what makes it, as a practical matter, difficult, because a lot of times when you do surveys and interviews of people, you'll discover that they say, no, we want to pay dowry because this is our protection for our daughter. And you're like, what do you mean? You're paying it to them. They're hoping basically it stays like this and that it also works to assuage the boy's side to be inclined to treat people better, let's say. There could be other reasons too. I don't want to suggest that's the only thing. But this complicates the matter because when the courts look at this, they understand this dynamic is at play. Everything is kind of interrelated. All right. So that's background. Changes in dowry, right? So the common perception is that dowry has increased dramatically over the last century, right? In fact, I'm going to just, I have a list of studies which I have not put here because I wouldn't have any space. So here's what they look like, if I can get there. These are all different studies that are using data on dowry to come to the conclusion that there's actually an increase in dowry, except for 2 of them, which I'll get to in just a minute. Let me see if I can get back there. All right, 1 minute. I think we're on page 6, right? Yes, okay. Great. So here's a few things about the studies. The data is often lacking or missing. Given that dowry is illegal, people are not very open about it. Most of these studies rely upon surveys in rural India. Why are they going there? People in the rural environments are often unaware of the fact that dowry demands are illegal. So they often don't mind saying what they get, right? A few things to note about this. First, there's actually tremendous regional variation and in ways that don't make a lot of sense, at least on first cut. For example, you see increases in states that are thought to be highly educated and egalitarian. Kerala has the highest rate of increase in dowries over the last 20 years. It is the most educated and generally perceived to be the most egalitarian of states in India. While in other states, you actually see little increase or even decreases. Odisha and Bihar, generally thought to be some of the most backward states in India, least educated, least egalitarian. That's weird, right? Second, the rural-urban patterns are very different. Most studies that look at inflation-adjusted dowry amounts in rural India using these same surveys actually find that dowry demands in rural India have actually probably declined, and they certainly haven't increased. To the extent that there's a perception that dowry has been increasing, it's almost entirely about urban India, which is also puzzling because urban India is the most educated part of India, the most sort of westernized and modern and all of this. What's going on? Also, there's evidence that you actually see dowry rates increasing after criminal penalties have been enhanced, which just seems perverse. And here to make things even a little weirder, oftentimes higher education leads to higher dowry. Or I won't say leads suggests causation. I will say it's associated with it. Okay, we've also seen some places shifting from bride price to dowry, even though the amounts are small. Most of this rise seems to start with dowries chasing men who hold government positions. And the typical logic is they have a steady income, they have high status, and of course over the last 40 years, shall we say, possibility of substantial unofficial income. I'll leave it to your vivid imaginations to guess what that might mean. Okay, what explains this, right? Assuming the data is not unreliable, because I don't have a way to check, you're relying upon what people say, which is one of the reasons why it's good to get proxies for dowry. Okay, so here are some of the explanations put forward in the literature for the perceived dowry increases. Something called the marriage squeeze and something called hypergamy. Now, when I first read hypergamy, I'm like, no, India doesn't do polygamy. It's not the same thing. We'll get to it in a minute. Okay, the bottom line, though, for both of these is there's some evidence for both of them, but I would suggest to you that it's not all that persuasive. So, marriage squeeze. What is the marriage squeeze? Marriage squeeze is the notion that typically speaking, men marry someone younger than them. With increasing amounts of people living longer, that means that every generation has more people than the one before, simply put, right? Typically speaking, because you still have more than a 2-person birth rate amongst women. So they're more than replacing the population. That basically means that a man who's marrying younger actually has more girls to choose from than an older man does in that sense, because they're looking at a different population. The fact that there are fewer men relative to women suggests that's a marriage squeeze that should bid up the price of men. That's sort of the argument here. I think this is very plausible for the rural environments. Why? Because men have actually been migrating out of rural environments for a long time in India, usually to go to the cities, right? The irony, of course, is you don't see any increase in dowry in the rural areas, suggesting that the marriage squeeze, to the extent it's likely to be present, can't be that compelling because it's not applying in the area you would expect to see it the most. What about hypergamy? Hypergamy is basically the fact that women's families may be willing to essentially buy into a high-earning man's bracket, so to speak, right? Now, this might sound strange to an audience here, or maybe it doesn't. In the Indian context, this is not at all strange. I mean, back in the day, like in the 70s and the 80s, the way you got jobs was to bribe the interviewer. So similarly, how do you land a good husband? Pay for it, right? This is sort of the argument. Now, I'm caricaturing it a bit just because I'm a lawyer and that's what we do, so it's helpful to start there. Okay, so I think hypergamy is very plausible in urban environments. Why? Because that's where you see the highest growth rates in men's income. That makes sense to me. Problem, that's also where women are the most likely to be working outside of the house, which should cut against dowry, or at least lead to a decline in dowry, but that is not the perception. The perception is the urban environments are actually where it's been escalating the most. Now, you could make a kind of a tongue-in-cheek argument, which is to say, well, if you didn't have women working, the rate of increase would be even higher. I love counterfactuals because there's absolutely no way for me to prove or disprove it, which is perfect for a lawyer. That's exactly the kind of argument you want. No one can disprove you, no one can prove you, and you get paid for saying it. Fabulous, right? Okay. I will say this, though. I don't think hypergamy by itself can be the only explanation. Why is that? Generally speaking, hypergamy presumes that men's incomes are rising quite quickly. That assumes some level of growth in the economy that would lead to that, right? Or at least for that group of people. It's not clear that you had that kind of cross-India growth until somewhere in the 1980s, but most of the increase in dowries occurs basically right after independence, which is kind of depressing, but from about the 50s through the 70s. Further, for hypergamy to explain things, you actually need to have some reason to believe that the set of well-off men now are somehow different than the well-off men over the last 5,000 years. It's not as if income is coming to India for the first time now, right? India and China represented 50% of global GDP for 4 millennia. There have been lots of rich people in those countries, right? If there are lots of rich people, why is it in the past dowry wasn't such a big deal, but all of a sudden now it is? There has to be some explanation for that if hypergamy is going to really work. Okay, so what do I think might be going on? So now we get to the, hopefully, I don't know if it's depressing or not, but we'll get to it. I'm going to suggest that actually a very likely explanation to look at is what I call the increasing mobility of the groom. Okay, most of the rise in dowry, and indeed many later rises over the last 50 years, basically start with grooms who are in government service. And then later, those who start living abroad, the NRIs, the non-resident Indians. I'm going to simplify by just referring to government positions now because saying foreign living and all that just becomes cumbersome. So the typical IS officer, that's Indian Administrative Service, right? That branch of government service grew dramatically after independence. Why is that? One, prior to independence, most of the top civil servants were actually British. That makes sense. The British were trying to rule the country. They're not going to allow Indians to be running the most important senior positions. As soon as the British cleared out, all the senior positions were now going to be staffed by Indians. But moreover, the Indian government grew dramatically post-independence, partially because they adopted what I think can be some people have described as Fabian socialism. Let's just call it a simpler term, a bigger role for the state and society than was there prior to that. So you have government officers populating the entire array of positions. The government was and still is the largest single employer in India. Back in the 50s and 60s, it was a massively more important employer than it even is today. Okay. Now, what's interesting is as the Indian state expands, if you look at where this points in time when the Indian state expands its reach bigger and bigger, within a couple of years, you begin to see increases in dowry, right? All right. Now, of course, as I mentioned, government officers have a lot of benefits. They have a consistent salary. They actually have a ton of fringe benefits. I mean, it's incredible how nice they treat government officers, not least of which is the bungalows, yes, that they would live in. And the status, of course. So this is attractive to a lot of families. But it's interesting to note, to get into government service in India, the policy was that typically an officer would start outside of his home state, and then every time they got promoted, they'd actually be required to move. What does that mean? It basically means that the groom would have to leave his natal home. Now you might think, well, why don't the parents just move with the groom? Well, they might have other children who are in school, or their friends are there, or they don't want to move every 3 years when he gets promoted. This basically means they're going to have to move away. Now, this is actually a disadvantage for the parents of the groom. Why? In India, then and now, there is no social security. that means your retirement plan is what? I'm going to live with my son. All of a sudden, being in government service means that is not likely to happen, at least for quite some time. Or it might require your son to actually give up certain promotions to go back and live with you, which is also kind of a fraught decision for a lot of parents. Moreover, some people might believe that this ability to move away from the natal home is actually an advantage to the wife and her parents, because now the wife is living in kind of more of a nuclearite family, whereas before it was a joint family structure. So, let's see if I can get this here. These government positions are basically imperiling the groom's parents' intended use of their resources, right? And you can imagine groom's parents wanting some recompense for that. And who do they go to? They're not going to go to the state, right? Because dowry, of course, is illegal. Who are they going to go to? The girl's parents. They're the ones who are partial beneficiaries of this. Moreover, the girl's parents are inclined to make this payment because there's some advantage to them in being in this setup. And all of a sudden, you start seeing a rise. Indeed, you see a very similar rise when you see the number of Indians living overseas increasing. It has a very similar feel to it, right? You go overseas, your income level increases, your standard of living might be perceived to be better, depending on who you talk to. And also, again, you're inclined towards a more nuclear family structure, or at least not in the big joint family structure. That, again, you see the groom prices beginning to go up. Okay, now I'm suggesting that this might be an interesting explanation. I don't think it's the only explanation, but boy, it fits the facts really well, right? A few more things about this. Here are some things that helps to explain. So first, highly educated states like Kerala, why is their dowry rising? Well, the highly educated are the ones who are probably most likely to clear the IS exams or the government exams because they're hard to clear. They're also the ones that tended to populate overseas positions quite a bit. That's consistent with this, right? Second, most government officers actually come from urban environments, right? In that context, this might help to partially explain the urban-rural divide in some ways. Not entirely, but it's one way. Third, the urban area is the one place in India where caste norms are less binding, the caste norms that were helping to constrain dowry in the past. They don't really typically apply the moment you hit the city, or at least they apply much more weakly. All right. Further, you begin to see nuclearization of families mainly in the urban areas, which again is going to put upward pressure on dowry. It's also ironic at multiple levels that government positions being the ones that have the highest dowries actually contributes to the law not being enforced properly. Because of course, if the government are the folks who are benefiting from high dowry payments, why would they be inclined to pursue enforcement of dowry actions aggressively? It would be almost backwards, right? All right, now I'm in the process of actually testing this with survey data as well as some other data that we have, which I can talk about a little bit later. All right, now I want to mention again, this may not be the only explanation. It's clear that in the last 10 years, weddings involve a lot of status signaling, especially in the metros, the big cities, right? So if you've gone to India and you've seen the big fat Indian wedding, which makes the big fat Greek wedding look small, right? What you'll discover is that people spend like crazy amounts of money for weddings. I don't mean just crazy in terms of jewelry, I mean the actual wedding ceremony. A lot of expenses that don't benefit anyone's bottom line except the service provider. I'll give you an example. So I go to to India in the winter period, which is a huge mistake because that's wedding season. And since I know people in India, that means I have to go to these weddings. So I go to the weddings, and typically what I do is I shut off my brain and I just observe, like I'm watching a movie. And typically what you observe is every year something more ostentatious is on display. The last time I went, I had 3 weddings where they rented out the services of Cirque du Soleil that was visiting India at the time for the wedding. Now you're like, where is this happening, right? Is this happening like in a tent or somewhere? No, it's happening in Le Méridien. I'm like, where are you? What is Cirque du Soleil doing in Le Méridien? It's not like they have a 10-story atrium where you can do these events. They're just improvising and doing stuff, right? My personal favorite, though, has to be in Haryana, where I went to a wedding in Haryana, God knows why, but I did. It was hilarious. Why? One guy from one place was marrying a girl from another place. Their 2 cities were about 5 kilometers apart. He took a helicopter. Come on. What's the point of a helicopter, right? You're just showing that you're cool, that's all, right? That doesn't go to benefit the bottom line of the girl's side or your side. It's just pure expenditure, right? Now, it's interesting. In separate work, I've suggested that this kind of status-seeking activity is really important in an environment where people cannot assess your net worth. Why? Because your net worth is unaccounted for, which is one reason why, perhaps, you might see a lot of this increasing. But it probably also has some impact on how one thinks about dowries, because typically, a lot of the showy weddings involve the girl's side footing the bill. Okay. All right. So that's depressing. Although, maybe interesting if we can think about what you can do with the government officers here, because that's an interesting time. Well, I do want to talk about decreases in dowry. Maybe there's something uplifting about this, because I remember Farina's admonition. So there are actually places in India where dowry has decreased. Oh, good news. Why? Okay. So Bihar. Parts of Bihar have something called Pakwada Shadi, which basically means shadi by pakad, which means grabbing the person and holding them and marrying them. That does not sound terribly voluntary. It isn't. So what's happening here? So in some parts of Bihar, dowry demands had become so large that parents of prospective brides thought it was better to pay goons. Now, I'm not making this up, okay? Better to pay goons to kidnap the groom and compel a marriage along with its consummation. That's important, because if the marriage is unconsummated, you can get an annulment, which takes a few months. If it's consummated, you need a divorce that takes 6 to 7 years, which is problematic. Then after some acceptable cooling off period, I don't know what that means. How long would it take me to cool off if someone kidnapped my son? Never. But, anyway, whenever you cool off, the girl's side approaches the boy's side again and tries to negotiate a lower dowry than they would otherwise pay on a very simple logic, which is if your son were to get divorced from us now, that would take 6 years and they'd be a divorcee with kids. Their value in the aftermarket is lower. So why don't you just pay us that aftermarket value now with some premium? And so I remember reading this thinking, wow, this is different. Initially I thought this must just be kind of one or two crazy people doing things, right? Well, no, crazy apparently is contagious. So what's happening apparently is over the last 20 years, on average, there are 2,000 groom nappings in Bihar. Bihar represents 18 to 20% of all kidnappings in India, of which virtually all of them are men, grown men. Okay. All right. Over time, you've actually seen a tempering of dowry demands, because if the thing that's motivating someone to kidnap your son is high dowry, maybe one way to reduce that is either to live in a fort or alternatively to reduce dowry demands. Okay. And you actually begin to see a dowry demand decrease in the parts of Bihar that have the highest groom napping rates. This is not a policy suggestion. Right? It is just a reference to what apparently is happening. Now, it's worth noting, this cannot work without the support or the blind eye of neighbors and those in law enforcement. Now, law enforcement might go along with this because they're getting kickbacks, right? But others, apparently, when you do interviews with them, they think that the groom's family was demanding too much in dowry. And they thought, well, we need to find a way to stop that. Now, what is the metric for determining what is too much? I have no idea. They don't appear to have a clear idea, but they have some sense. It's kind of like we know it when we see it. All right, but that seems peculiar that you could have this. And over time, it appears that the move towards lowering dowry was some sort of community decision making. They got together and said, look, we got to reduce this arms race. Right? Because, of course, what would boys' side starts doing if they thought that their boys were getting kidnapped? Well, they start hiring guys to protect from the kidnapping, who sort of follow you around, right? I should mention, just as an aside, I know we're running a little short of time, but I'll mention it anyway just for fun. I did some interviews where you figure out how much the goons actually charge. So typically they charge between 4 to 5 lakhs. That's 4 to 500,000 rupees. About half of that, well, around 300,000 rupees is in cash. The remaining is in kind. You're expected to throw them a party before they go and kidnap the groom with a lot of alcohol and apparently a lot of mutton. There you go. I just thought you might find that interesting. All right, where else do you see decreases in dowry? Actually, parts of Gujarat, which is bizarre because Gujarat overall as a state has seen an increase in dowry. But there are some parts that have actually seen a decrease. Navsari, Anand saw mild declines due to what seemed to be social understandings amongst the families there that large dowry demands warp decision making. No, really. Yes. They were getting worried that people were marrying outside of community because they're being motivated to do it for money. So they started getting together and saying, you know what, we don't think this works very well for us. Now remember, these are largely business communities that like to marry within community for other reasons. So they came in and said, you know what, we're going to start a practice where we want to reduce the amount of dowry and move it more towards something that doesn't seem to influence your decision in terms of who you marry. Now interesting, this is precisely the kind of reasoning that's used in the subcaste historically to contain dowry. They're worried about people going out of caste, so they try to constrict it this way. Okay. There are some urban areas that are seeing shifts in dowry composition. I've mentioned, of course, the moving towards spending on weddings, right? Part of this, of course, is motivated by that you won't get caught as easily by dowry regulation since there is no asset for someone to show. You just spent it, right? But also it signals status, right? Which may be something that matters more in environments where people have unaccounted for money. This is all kind of a norm, right? How do you signal how important you are, right? If you go to someone in Delhi or in Bombay in the business community or related to government and you ask them, well, how do you determine if someone is very rich, since no one actually reveals how much money they make because they're trying to evade taxes? Well, the car, the cell phone, right? That's typically it. In fact, people will change their cell phone every year to say that they have money. That's the whole point. Those are social norms, again, right? These declines, as I'm suggesting here, seem to be motivated in changes in social norms, and they're sticking. Notice, no law enforcement here. That's interesting. Are there ways in which you could actually maybe catalyze that to do something for you besides these random occurrences? These are like lightning bolts in the dark. All right. So what kind of insights do you get from this? So if groom mobility is an important factor, then what reforms do you want to consider? Counterintuitively, you might actually think about the state providing stipends to parents or allowing some way in which they get some recompense so there's no need to actually take it from the girl side. Will this work now? I doubt. Why? Because they've gotten used to it, right? It's hard to change practices overnight. You'll need to club it with something else. So I'm open to other suggestions too. What about third-party enforcement strategies, making it harder to spend on certain things? Having hotels, for example, state where they got the money from. Banks do that already in India, right? What about actually putting limits on how much cash can be withdrawn? We actually do that right now in India. After demonetization, as unusual as that move was, one of the effects of that has been that now it's actually very hard to pull cash in large amounts out of bank accounts. That's going to make it hard for you to pay dowry bribes, so to speak, right? Okay. And maybe even consider providing incentives to those who provide dowry-relevant information. Now, I'm a little worried about that because this could be a great way to sort of stick, the axe in someone's back. But it is an interesting way in which to try to get any information. All right. Of course, investments in female human capital and job prospects might be very useful here because that might counteract some tendencies towards increasing dowry. It's worth noting that investments in female human capital do not seem to be unidirectional. You would think that would reduce dowry, but most of the evidence suggests that it increases it. The primary reason for that is a mix of two things. Once you get educated to a higher level, the subset of grooms you're chasing after are likely to be the highest end grooms that everybody is chasing after. So the price points become even higher, so to speak. The other thing, of course, and this sort of depends on what you make of various interview-based studies, a lot of the grooms' families think that education is somehow correlated with the willingness to quarrel. Is that the right word? Yes. Which doesn't bode well for that. Job prospects, on the other hand, employment is consistently related with lower dowries. So one way in which you might be able to do that is actually government policy that tries to increase the types of positions and opportunities for women for employment. Not just education, that they get the degrees and sit at home, but actually do something with them, which might be very, very interesting to explore. All right. As I mentioned before, there are strong differences in rural and urban patterns. You may want to consider if enforcement efforts can be actually a little more targeted. How do you encourage social norms to emerge or re-emerge to constrain dowry? I think public education is good, but I think you also have to start dealing with different communities and understanding what's motivating their behavior. Now, I have two websites for you because we live in the 21st century, so we have to look at the web. Here we go. Dowry calculator. Who would have thought this would be something that could actually exist? Remember, dowry is illegal. Okay, I thought I would do this for fun, right? Fun is the wrong word. An example is the right word. I'm going to give you an example. So say the groom is between 36 to 40. Let's say that they are Jat. Let's say that they are a lawyer. How's that? Let's say their salary is more than 2 lakhs. Let's say they went to Harvard. Notice this? Isn't that nice? I'll do that again just so you get a feel of it. Interesting, right? Okay. USA, right? This is the weirdest one. Groom skin color. Notice you should notice, of course, that this means that this is a little bit of a joke, right? 5'11", right? And then if you go up, let's say your father was a doctor, they give you a dowry amount. Now, this is actually meant to be a joke, as you would have guessed from the groom's skin color, the fairy white, pitch black. Okay. But actually, if you go and do interviews with people, this is not far off from what the actual estimate would be. Now, the reason I suggest this is public education, this dowry calculator is actually borrowed from shadi.com, which many of you know is a website that is supposed to facilitate marriages amongst Indian, South Asian couples. Here's the actual shadi.com website, 36 to 40, other, more than 2 lakhs, PhD, lives out of India. Do you own a house? Yes. Do you own a car? Yes. Calculate dowry amount. This is what they do when you do it. Okay. That's nice. That's a little bit of a cold awakening, as they say, right? And actually, then they proceed to actually provide you with more information about what dowry demands tend to do in the Indian environment. And I think, although it's not by itself not going to work altogether, it's a nice way to get people to actually focus on what the issue is a little bit, right? That is the treatment of women, the patriarchy, and how their options are being severely constrained. Okay, let me get back to my presentation, if I can find it. Let's do this. There we are. Good, that worked. All right. Okay. So let's just get this last slide, more or less. So I will mention that some reforms that have been thought to reduce dowry actually seem to increase it. In 2005, when they changed the inheritance laws to allow women to have equal inheritance rights to men, that actually led to an increase in dowries. Why is that? Because the groom side said, oh, so you're entitled to more. Great. Why not just have it now? Right? That was the sort of reasoning. I should mention this is pretty much the reasoning behind why you see increases in dowry following the increasing criminal penalties. Given the baseline level of corruption and problems in India's law enforcement mechanism, whenever you increasingly criminalize behavior, you don't actually deter it necessarily. Why is that? If the cops are corrupt and the judiciary has difficulty telling the difference between making a dowry demand and not making a dowry demand is not that much. You might get accused of it either case, and you might face the same outcome. When the gap between doing something bad and doing something good diminishes, the incentive to do something bad increases. That's a weird attribute to having kind of a corrupt law enforcement structure. It induces people to be bad because they don't see the value of being good. The value of being good is now just whatever your moral code is, as opposed to actually being a big penalty difference. Also, it's interesting, that kind of behavioral pattern is way more consistent with behavior that is, being sort of weirdly regulated by the criminal process. You're creating essentially a black market, and then as you increase the penalties, the price goes higher. That's what a black market looks like. Okay. All right, and I should mention, again, my call for more data, better use of proxies. There's a wonderful paper by Bharotra et al., it's 2016, dealing with gold, how movements in gold prices predict very, very, very accurately actually changes in dowry prices, which I think is worth looking at because that gets you out of the business of having to rely upon people's potential desire to lie to you about what's going on and looking at real things that actually might impact dowry behavior. Okay, I'm just going to leave the conclusions on the ground, on the slide here because that's just a summary of what I've said pretty much throughout this whole thing. The objective, as I mentioned, of this paper was to get people looking at changes in dowry as a way to understand how it operates and maybe getting a sense as to what levers might be the best to push to get changes. So if groom mobility is important, that suggests a certain set of policy reforms, right? If social norms are important, that suggests a different set of policy reforms, some overlap, right? Beginning to think in these terms and also noticing the distinctions between regions and rural and urban divides might actually get you to a better place than where we are now with increasing criminalization, which I don't think is necessarily bad. It's just the way it's enforced tends to make the problem somewhat worse. If you could enhance or improve the criminal justice system in India, that might pay high dividends. People have been trying to do that outside of the dowry context for the better part of 70 years. It hasn't quite worked yet. Okay, I'll end with that, and I'll be delighted to take any comments, questions, or suggestions you might have. Thank you.
Okay. Take your own questions.
That's perfect. Yeah.
But we do have a mic that is for recording, so we are going to ask. Ariana has the mic, and so if you pick on people,
Sure.
she will dash over to the mic.
Sure, go ahead. Well, maybe wait for her to have the mic, yeah.
Yeah, so it was a really wonderful talk. Incidentally, I'm a 1L here, who's a fifth year, I think, PhD candidate in anthropology at Boston University.
Oh,
so
congratulations,
I also
hey.
hopped from
Go
BU to
Terrier.
Michigan,
Yeah.
So one big question I have that I kind of thought about when you were mentioning this is you mentioned that there's kind of a change in the kind of property associated with dowry. And I was wondering, what is that change exactly? Because your two theories that you suggested, one was the pre-mortem inheritance, which is usually what a dowry is associated with.
Yes.
But then the other one was supporting parents, single parents, when the children moved out. That's actually, there's a tension between those two things, because that's actually a groom price. And so you then basically have a competition between the bride's future interests and her present interests.
Correct.
And since it's illegal, I would expect if there's more interest in the pre-mortem inheritance that you would give something that had a title that would go into the bride's name. And so I was kind of interested in kind of the transformation of this. And I would say, interestingly, we see it, the United States, I basically, and I think most Americans who got married, received a dowry, except it was in the wedding. And of course, I gave my wife, not a bride price, because a bride wealth, because it didn't go to her family, but I gave her the ring, which traditionally is supposed to be 3 months' salary. So there's kind of an interesting correlation there. And just the very last thing, just a comment, the kidnapping is actually very common.
Yes.
But usually among bride wealth societies, when the bride wealth becomes very high. I was actually going to ask you about that before you mentioned that the kidnapping was a solution to this. So,
interesting. Okay, great. So let me try to answer the first bit first, which is what are they spending on? So traditionally, most dowry items were jewelry. And the thing is, the groom side is generally uncomfortable with receiving land entitled in the daughter-in-law's name, because it becomes hard for them to capture it, right? Jewelry, on the other hand, is mobile, and people don't keep track of it as much. They would prefer the property be in their name or in some other name or something that isn't directly tied to the woman. The change has been that instead of demanding, give us property, give us more and more cash, people are increasingly saying, we want you to throw an opulent wedding. Now, this is primarily in the urban environments, especially Delhi and Bombay. Now, money, of course, is fungible, right? That doesn't mean it grows fungus. It just means, it can be, if you don't spend on this, that means you've saved it for something else. But the irony, of course, is this money is being spent to benefit it doesn't go to the bottom lines of any of these people, except indirectly, which is in the status signal that's being sent, right? That we belong to this level, right? Now, why is that important? And why can't you just say that you're making that much money? Well, if you say you're making that much money, then your unaccounted for money would need to be accounted for, and that people seem to want to avoid. Sometimes the money you're making is through, shall we say, not such good means, right? And that means you want to keep that out of the eyes of people too. But at the same time, you want to communicate that you have that much money. So how do you do that? Ostentatious displays of wealth, right? So you essentially throw these weddings. The hotels are more than happy to do this because it benefits their bottom line. Why is that signal valuable? Well, it turns out a lot of business dealings in an environment where you cannot assess someone's creditworthiness depend upon how much money they have. Well, how do you prove you have a lot of money? You're willing to eat it, right? Or burn it, as the case may be, or give it to Cirque du Soleil or whatever, right? The other thing that might matter is if you have other children you need to get married, boy, what a great signal that is, right? See how well off we are that we can literally hire Cirque du Soleil to come and prance around in a 3-story building, right? I mean, if you've seen Cirque du Soleil, it's kind of a strange fit. That's like asking Michael Jordan to play basketball in a box. Why would you do that? Right. So that's one. The kidnappings is interesting, right? I mean, you do hear of them in bride wealth societies. Indeed, in the Hindu epics, discussions of kidnapping brides are very common, actually, right? Where you see people kidnap a woman who they usually say is in love with you, and her parents are objecting to the marriage, so you kidnap and get married or something. That is not what this is, right? Oftentimes the guys are actually unaware of who the girl is most of the time. They're usually not too enthusiastic about getting married because, they just got kidnapped. That's not the natural reaction to being kidnapped. Oh, let's get married, It's a sort of a strange fit. What is intriguing about it to me at some level is the people who are paying the high dowries in Bihar, that means implicitly they have a choice between paying the high dowry or doing the kidnapping and paying a lower dowry. What leads you to choose one over the other? Is it just the amount? Or is it something in the ambient enforcement structure that leads you to? Bihar is thought to be one of the most lawless places in India. That's consistent with this, right? So, yes, ma'am. Maybe just wait for the...
So you mentioned Bihar, and
Yes.
Also I was thinking about Bihar and Uttar Pradesh in terms of female infanticide.
Yes.
And I was wondering, so in areas where the male population is much higher than the female, why isn't the bride price much more common than the dowry? Aren't females considered a rarer and more valuable asset in those places?
Great question. So many of you may be familiar with Amartya Sen's, I think, paper from years ago that said there are 100 million women missing in India, right? Either due to female infanticide, poor nutrition, and so forth and so on, and deaths and others. The interesting thing about that is if you take a look at the states that have the worst male to female ratios, worse in the sense that there are way more men than women. Haryana, I think, Haryana and Punjab are typically like for every 100 men, there are 75 women. Which is like, wow, what's going on, right? That's incredible. You would think that there'd be like massive unrest in this environment. They import in brides from Kerala. Is typically one of the key states they go to because Kerala has a much better ratio of women to men. They typically have for every 100 men about 103 women. So you see the importing in of brides. You do still see news reports suggesting that there's a higher degree of ambient violence in these states because you have all these men who are unmarried or something, right? That seems to be one explanation. The other is that in a lot of places where you see the imbalance, part of the explanation that's going on is, although there's an imbalance of men to women, a lot of the men are migrating to other places, so that begins to counteract it. So if you're looking, for example, in the villages in Punjab, a lot of the men are truck drivers, or they're doing work in Chandigarh or in Delhi or whatever, Ludhiana. They're beginning to leave that environment. So the imbalance that's occurring is actually getting readdressed through economic forces. And they then don't necessarily think to marry the girls back in the village. Some do, but not all. That causes a little bit of a strange dynamic then. Sure, go ahead.
This is a relatively very short question, and you can see my point right away. So how many female government officers is there in India?
Excellent question, right? Because you would presumably think that with female government officers, they should be the people who have the least amount of dowry charged, right? Or maybe even get a bride price, right? So the number of women who are entering government service is still less than the men, but it's actually not terrible. Over the last 10 years, I'd say if you looked at the toppers, as they call them, the top candidates in the government services as well as the engineering exams, a good percentage of them are actually women. We don't know anything about what their dowries or other marriage prospects are. Very little. Again, that's a call for data. Can we get data? But still, the vast majority are going to be men right now. But I would say that that's been changing. Like if you went back to my uncle's time, who's an IS officer, that time there'd be precious few women who actually got in. Now you see a higher percentage for sure. We just don't know enough about what is happening with their marriage situations and who they marry to. Now, of course, the irony is that the set of people they're going to want to marry presumably are successful men, which a lot of people want to marry apparently. And that means that they're going to be competing for that. Now, they might pay a dowry, but they might pay less than they otherwise would if they weren't that educated and didn't have that good of a job. No way to know what that counterfactual is without real data. Yes, in the back there.
You know, when I was working in India for NGOs, and including Madhu Kishwar's work,
Nice.
that was like 20 years ago, and we
Yes.
found that there were a lot of studies being done showing that in most instances of dowry deaths, it wasn't a male relative, it was a female relative.
Yes.
So following up on the question of whether or not more women in the government, like in IAS positions, would have changed that. Has there been any other work or have there been any other studies since then, or have you followed any other studies since then in terms of the rate of dowry deaths and who actually committed them?
So the rate of dowry deaths, there's some evidence on, which is typically it's around 8,000 to 9,000 a year on average. Those are, of course, reported dowry deaths. So you can assume that's an underrepresentation of the actual number. Since we're guessing, let's say it's 30,000 a year, roughly speaking. We don't really have a lot of good evidence on who did it. Now, the trouble, of course, is when you have to sort of think, how's the dowry death occurring, right? If it's by strangulation or something quite violent, chances are, like hand-to-hand violence, chances are that it's a male member doing it for a variety of reasons. If it's by, like, explosion in the kitchen, chances are that it's a woman doing it. Partially because if it's not a woman doing it, how would the man who's doing it know that his wife doesn't get blown up in the process, right? There's been some discussion of that, but precious little. There are anecdotal accounts that, yes, it's still women. Sometimes it varies tremendously, but there is some evidence to indicate that other women are doing it. I didn't take your question as being whether female government officers might make the law enforcement work better, but I thought your question was more about what happens to their bride price and things like that, right? But that's a natural question too. If you had more female government officers, more female judges, let's say, female police officers, would that change? So we can say something about judges. There are very few female judges in India, right? Very sad, actually, because a large number of attorneys who are graduating are actually women. Part of the reason for that is the rate of female labor market participation in India is low relative to educational levels. It's typically about a third of those who are educated enough to work, which is very, very low when you think about it. There are more female police officers, but they're typically assigned to the cells for crimes against women or something like that, I think, in major metro areas. And that has an impact on how the enforcement works. But typically, they're very worried about exacerbating a situation to a point where divorce occurs. Because when a divorce occurs, the woman is kind of in not a very good position. So even their incentives are kind of compromised in a way, because without changes in the underlying divorce laws, they don't want to push people into a situation which might lead to them being impoverished. Which, even though there are more of them, they have to worry about that sort of flowback.
I think I've got the microphone.
Oh, good.
I enjoyed your talk a lot.
Thank
Vic.
you.
Thank you. I guess my question is, maybe it's legal theory or
Okay.
method or something. Other than the rural-urban differences, maybe calling for different kinds of regulation.
Yeah.
It seems like a lot of your suggestions or prescriptions don't have to do with new legislation. I mean, you began the talk with a 1961 law that's based in a 1860 penal code, and we were meant to kind of wonder at the moribund quality of that.
Yes.
And your method seems to be, well, let's look and see how it works. And then we can see if there are levers that we can apply some force to change the practices. Would that extend to legislation? Would you see new kinds of laws, or maybe removing the laws that are on the books? Are there legislative, legal, even code remedies that you see as a lawyer that would address this dynamic milieu?
So as a law professor, I'm always full of law reform ideas, right? Typically, my students can't get me to stop shutting up about it. So I'm delighted that someone actually wants me to say more. The main reason why I don't push very hard on law reform is because the key problem with most law reform issues in India is not the law. The typical problem is the enforcement. And as a political matter, and just sort of like, you might wonder, why is it that the police have such incredible arrest powers in India, right? They can arrest almost anybody, it seems. The reason for that is the arrest power is written in the 1860 Police Act of India, 1861 Police Act. What was the 1861 Police Act? That was the act put forward by the British after the mutiny in 1875. The goal was to make the police impel order, right? So they give them a wide array of arrest powers and made them responsive to their political masters. Everybody complains about it, but as soon as they become government, they like having the police who respond to their political masters. So the political dynamic is completely backwards there in that respect, because it's very hard then to get a ruling dispensation to move away from that. Similarly with the dowry setup, if the people who are benefiting the most from the dowry setup are government officers, you have a big, big problem then in trying to enforce the law, because that's their job, right? So it's not so much that I don't think law reform can be useful. It is, without accompanying changes in the enforcement apparatus, it's very difficult to do. And some of my suggestions here are really designed to get to the enforcement status. Stipends to the Groom's family, or other ways in which you can adjust that, are designed to get to that, because that's going to make it, hopefully get the enforcement ring. Then you can maybe begin to think about what you're going to do with the law. I can suggest a few law changes that might matter, but I'm very, very skeptical that in the current enforcement environment, that they're going to lead to anything terribly different.
Yes.
Who's next? Oh, yes, sorry.
Sure. Among my friends, one of the tensions is between the family firm
Yes.
and dowry.
Mm-hmm.
It shifts capital assets to a different family, and there have to be joint discussions about that. And I was thinking one of the major differences between India and here is that a huge percentage of people are self-employed, which puts the strategy of the family firm directly, in some ways, in conflict with dowry. I wonder if you'd comment on that.
Sure. So it's interesting. I did actually do interviews of some family businesses because I figured this would be where you might see, dowries being most openly discussed. And it often is, right? Although they're smart, they know they're talking to a lawyer, so they don't say, we did this, but we've heard. We've heard. It's like, I'm not hearing anything from anybody, you are. That's good, okay. So typically what they'll tell you is this, is that, yes, no one enjoys paying dowry, it seems, but they don't think of it as just being like money being burned. So a lot of their thinking is, a business family that has boys needs to marry someone, right? If we marry them, we get access to their contacts and we're more likely to do business with them too. Why? Because you don't rely on the law to enforce contracts in India per se, you rely upon family connections, right? So they actually see an advantage to getting getting access to that family. How do you get access to that family if you're not already having access to them? Well, one way is you marry in, right? It's a marital alliance, which is typically how it's phrased. It's a marriage alliance, right? So for them, they think, hey, this is actually not such a bad deal because our sons, the girls may have brothers, or even if they don't, our business interest might be benefited by connections with these business interests, right? And their business interests might be benefited with connections with ours. And it's not like they can go to families that have boys only and get those connections because they want to sort of do the interplay. Now that assumes, of course, that family is somehow binding and not entirely unidirectional, right? And I asked them that. I said, don't you always feel you're on the back foot? They said, sometimes, yes. But presumably they want their sons to have somewhat pleasant married lives too. And they also say, hey, we can withdraw some of our business things too if they seem to be behaving differently than what we'd like. Now, I don't know if that's wishful thinking or real or whatever, but it's conceivable. And if you think of it in that context, it is fascinating that most of the examples of dowry death that are reported in India are typically not amongst industrialist communities. Ajitesh? Yeah.
I have two comments to make.
Okay.
One, the law enforcement will remain a problem because many urban areas, people don't consider dowry to be a problem.
Yes.
People accept it. People want to give dowry for two reasons. A, I have a son, so I can recover the money.
Yes.
And B, if I don't have a son, it's ensure that my daughter will remain will have a happy married life and they won't trouble her.
Yes.
The second comment I want to make is that the increase in dowry in Kerala has in fact, and in Haryana, has in fact led to a system of polyandry in Haryana. So because when you import women from Kerala, because women want to go to Haryana because they cannot afford a wedding, they cannot afford to give dowry.
Yes.
So they want to go to Haryana, to a completely different culture, completely different
good.
country for them.
Yeah, that's
because they don't
nice.
speak the same language, they don't wear the same clothes.
Yeah.
And it's led to a system of polyandry because you have 5 men in Haryana marrying a single girl from Kerala. So that's
That's great. That's just the, boy, that's like the best example of jugaad I'd heard in a long time. For those of you unfamiliar with the concept of jugaad, that is improvising for that moment, right? It's like they look at the situation, they say, let's not try to change anything, but how can we get the best advantage of what's out there? And this sort of, that's perfect. They're matching on that front. That's interesting. I'll look a little more into that. Yes, I've heard very similar things in the urban environments that people want to pay dowry because they want to ensure the happiness of their daughters. That's, in a sense, a bit of a sad commentary in some ways, right? That they think they need to do that. The other thing that is really quite fascinating, and it sort of gets back to this. In the urban environments, typically women are more educated than in rural environments, but the labor market penetration is so low. And you ask yourself, well, why is that? And part of it is sometimes, the types of things they've got education and the positions are not there. But a lot of times it's just simply their in-laws say, we don't want you to work. And that seems puzzling. It's like you want a high dowry, but you don't want an income-earning bride. Why would that be? And part of it seems to be a little bit of status signaling, right? That I'm rich enough that my wife doesn't need to work, although everyone knows that you're getting a dowry for it, which that's like the emperor has no clothes. It's like, how come people don't see that? The other explanation, of course, is you think if they have outside options, that makes them more inclined to challenge whatever is the power structure within the joint family. Of course, it's hard to get people to say that. So I can imagine multiple explanations for that. But yes, that is something I've heard a lot, that they're happy to pay it because they think it insures them against bad things. Although I've heard stories of people saying, we're happy to pay, and then once they're married, they renege saying, if you want more, we'll lodge a 498. It's just, it's like watching a soap opera. It's crazy. Other questions? Okay, there's one guy who's left. Let's take this one. Last one, okay, yeah.
Actually, my question relates to your last point that you were making, which is about the central paradox that you're raising, that more modernization, an increase in dowry. And I'm wondering about how you'd be looking at modernization actually as simply markers of certain positive effects. Good. More education, more urbanization, increasing employment of women in urban centers. And I'm wondering whether we need to sort of also layer that, or our understanding of modernization with sort of, as we know in South Asia, modernization doesn't imply weakening of domestic ideology and sort of expectations of motherhood. And there's a sort of range of legal frameworks one could bring up to think about women in the workforce, Maternity Benefits Act and things like that. So perhaps looking at those laws in combination with dowry might actually, and also, tracking what is the shifting status of bride price, especially because it's interesting that if in the rural centers there's weakening or decreasing numbers of dowry incidents. It's interesting because in the rural sphere, actually, women's labor is far more integral to the family household, especially if men are migrating to the cities to find labor. So in that sense, and I'm saying this because there is some sort of historical work, say, of the 19th century, which is pointing to the fact that one can actually trace a shift from bride price to dowry. Yes. And that has to do with the penetration of domestic ideology, which maps on from the urban center to the rural center. And so that actually disenfranchises women's labor in the sense that if there's this expectation of motherhood, that means that sort of her traditional role of labor in the family is being taken away. And so dowry becomes more important. So in that sense, actually, I'm not trying to suggest that the rural sphere is this sort of romantic, more, reified sort of situation for women. But perhaps that's one way to track this sort of transformation, and perhaps sort of nuance our understanding of modernization as not simply meaning sort of positive effects. But
Perfectly fair. What does modernization mean? Does it mean doing a subset of things that various international organizations tell you reflects that you're modern, or does it mean something more than that? You're absolutely right. In fact, most studies that look at dowry historically, even going back to ancient Rome and Greece and so forth, would suggest to you, although there are other explanations, but one of the really strong explanations is that when women's labor is critical to the household, you don't tend to see dowry, right? Which is one of the reasons why I press a little on job prospects for women, because that's consistent with that account. So that's one. It is the case that in urban environments, although women are more educated and may work more in jobs than they do in villages, they don't necessarily work more than people in villages, right? The value of their labor is not the same as the income they're generating, the income they're receiving as a paycheck. And it may well be the case that women in rural environments are working much more, and as a result, the dowry demands are much less. In the urban environments, maybe you might think they're not, or whatever. An alternative explanation is they might be working similar amounts in both environments, but men in the urban environments get a much higher pay, so you get the hypergamy effect, which is people chase the money. But yes, I think what we think of as modern in South Asia is a really big, fascinating question, right? So I meet a lot of very erudite, interesting people who, on all outside indicia would appear to be modern, whatever we might think of modern, a global citizen, let's say, right? But when you probe a little bit below, you sometimes discover that the modernity is often a veneer, or it's kind of haphazard in the sense that sometimes they're modern on a few things, but not on all things. The logic behind why they're modern on this and not that is elusive. High variance, like some people, it's not obvious what exactly led to that outcome. But I take the point that when we say modernization, we need to be careful using it. I use it in the way that the prior literature uses it, which is indicia of modernness, meaning, do you have a functioning toilet? Do you have women, are they educated beyond a certain level? They're not asking the questions that might be most directly related to dowry, which is how much are you contributing to the household income?
So for those of you who are able to join us for our reception, we can continue the conversation. The reception is upstairs on the 6th floor. The elevator bank is in this direction, and we have people who can help direct you there. But let us thank Vik Khanna right now.
Thank you.